Good evening, everyone. If we could start, please. A very warm welcome to the London School of Economics and Political Science for this hybrid event, and therefore welcome to both you, the audience here tonight with us in person, but also those online. My name is Eric Neumeier. I am the President and Vice Chancellor of the LSE. I'm delighted to chair the George Lansbury Memorial Trust's annual lecture. The Trust, chaired by Professor Pippa Cotterell, who is here with us tonight, was set up to commemorate the life and work of George Lansbury, a Labour MP who supported social justice, women's rights, and disarmament. Each year, the Trust runs an annual lecture inspired by George Lansbury's work, and it's a pleasure to host for the second year at LSE the Trust's annual lecture on the extremely important topic of refugees and Britain's response to the global situation. And as you've seen in the news yesterday, it couldn't be more topical than that. The event is also co-hosted by the LSE Library. The library was founded in 1896, a year after the London School of Economics and Political Science, and I'm delighted that LSE Library are the proud custodians of the papers of George Lansbury, a significant archive of George's personal and political correspondence, which is open for anybody to come and take a look. LSE Library are pleased to announce today the digitization of the, and I trust this is not a typo, the 17th volume of George papers. Clearly he was very prolific, which you can now view online on the LSE Library's digital library. So as usual, there will be the chance for you to put your questions to our speaker. For our online audience, you can submit your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be screened by staff from the LSE Library who are here with us. Please let us know your name and affiliation. We're particularly keen to hear from our students and alumni. We are recording this event. If you decide to ask a question, would prefer for it not to be recorded, then please speak to a member of the stewarding team after the event, and we can take it out of the recording. For those of you here in the theater, I will let you know when we will open the floor for questions. Please raise your hand then, and when I call on you, kindly give us your name and affiliation before posing one and preferably short question. I will try to ensure a range of questions from both our online audience and our audience here in the theater. For those ex-users following the conversation, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSE Lansbury. The event is being recorded, as I said, and will hopefully be made available on the LSE Library's YouTube channel, subject to no technical difficulties. Okay, with this housekeeping out of the way, we have a fantastic speaker here tonight to help us explore tonight's very relevant topic on refugees, Britain's response and the global situation. I am absolutely delighted to introduce Lord Alf Dubs as our speaker. Lord Dubs is a Labour politician and leading refugee rights advocate. He was the MP for Battersea from 1979 to 1987, during which time he served for 4 years as a shadow Home Office minister. After leaving the Commons in 1987, he became the director of the Refugee Council and was appointed a Labour peer in 1994. In 1997, after Labour's election victory, he was appointed as a minister. These things do happen. He was appointed as a minister in Northern Ireland, where he served until the establishment of a new devolved administration following the Good Friday Agreement. Currently serves on the British-Irish Parliamentary Assembly and on the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe Parliamentary Assembly. He continues to campaign on human rights and is specifically on behalf of refugees, and you will hear tonight he's really passionate about that. In 2016, he sponsored an amendment which later became known as the Dubs Amendment to the Immigration Act 2016 to offer some unaccompanied refugee children stranded in camps in Europe safe passage to Britain, having himself arrived in Britain in 1939 on one of the Kindertransporte as a 6-year-old refugee child fleeing persecution in Czechoslovakia, which at the time was already occupied by Nazi Germany. Sadly, with every passing day and every passing year, it naturally becomes less and less likely that one of us can still hear life from a Holocaust survivor and learn from them. And so it is an absolute privilege and honor to hear from Lord Dubs tonight. Due to my double role as interim president and vice president planning and resource at the school, I cannot chair as many public events as I would like to, but I was adamant that I would make sure to chair this very special event. Lord Dubs, over to you, please.
Well, good evening, and thank you for the introduction. And I'm honoured and flattered to be invited here. I'm still hanging on when you talk about, so let's see how we go. Look, when you arranged the date, none of us had an idea, I certainly didn't, that it would be such a significant day in terms of the Supreme Court decision. And I had to change everything I was going to say today. Partly I wanted to keep up to date with anything new, and partly because it was quite a dramatic and interesting announcement. Now, let me make it clear, I'm speaking not as a lawyer, I'm not a lawyer, I'm speaking as a politician. So some of you will have more understanding of the subtleties of the Supreme Court decision, although it seemed to me it was a fairly clear one, but even so, some of you will be better placed than I am. But I'm going to talk more as a politician, and I'm going to talk more about, hopefully with a few insights into things that went on behind the scenes, which you may find slightly amusing. Because they did actually happen. But I think the clear point about the Supreme Court judgment is that the government found it an embarrassing, thank heavens, a very embarrassing blow. I suppose they half expected it, but nobody really knew what was going to happen. And I think they are now struggling to find a way through this. But let me say that even if the Supreme Court had allowed the government to go ahead, I still believe the policy of sending people to a distant country to have their asylum claims determined, I still believe that is quite the wrong policy. But fortunately, to have the legal backing for it being the wrong policy, as well as the political backing, makes it better. Now, what has the government said in response to the Supreme Court decision? Unless they've said something in the last few hours, I'm not up to date. But they're talking about having a new treaty with Rwanda. Although how we can have a treaty that tells people in Rwanda how they should deal with refugees, I'm not totally sure. They've said there's going to be some new emergency legislation, and they talked about several conventions and treaties which they want to change, amend, or nullify. They haven't said what, and nobody quite knows how they're going to do it, but we can speculate. So we've got the Geneva Convention, the 51 Geneva Convention on Refugees. We've got the Convention Against Torture. We've got the European Convention on Human Rights. And let me say a little bit, and there may be others as well. And of course, there's the Human Rights Act as well as part of the British legislation. But let me say just a word about the European Convention on Human Rights, because that seems to be the focus of much government attention. I used to serve on the Joint Committee on Human Rights, and we went twice to Strasbourg. And what was interesting was that they said very clearly that they would regard Britain moving away in some sense from the European Convention as being a very damaging step. Partly because we were, not only were we founder members of the ECHR, but we're also, probably of all countries, we had the best relationship between our courts and the European Court on Human Rights. And there were fewer adverse decisions as far as we were concerned. So they thought we were essentially the good guys. And these days, to go to the continent and regard the Brits as being called good guys is not common all over the place, but it certainly was there. And the other point about the ECHR, which some of the Tories, particularly the unlamented Home Secretary, up to 3 days ago, she she's been talking about Britain getting out of the European Convention on Human Rights. I'm not sure all the people who oppose it understand that it's not part of the European Union. But there's a lot of rubbish being talked based upon not very much knowledge. But certainly one key point, apart from what I've said already about the European Convention on Human Rights and the European Court, is that it's integral to the Good Friday Agreement for Northern Ireland. And we can't just sort of tear up the European ECHR and then pretend it won't have a knock-on effect into the Good Friday Agreement, which is one of the fundamental agreements and which has led to, much better conditions for the people of the whole of Ireland. Now, the government has said they're going to have some emergency legislation, and they're going to do it very quickly. And for the life of me, I'm not sure that they can do that. That's to say, I'm not sure what the emergency legislation is actually going to say, unless some government minister has announced it since I got on the tube this evening, and you may be more up to date than I am in that case. It is not clear what the emergency legislation will say, whether it will simply exempt asylum seekers and refugees from the workings of it, or whether it will somehow nuance it a bit. I don't know. All I would say is this. But although I think the Lord should be elected, so I'm not defending an unelected House, but it has certain benefits. For example, when we had the I'll say a bit in a little while, when we had the illegal migration bill, as it then was, going through Parliament, we amended it 20 times. Now, they didn't all survive. Most amendments didn't survive going to the Commons and so on, but at least there were 20 amendments. So there's something to be said for an unelected House, but that's for another topic on another day. However, emergency legislation, I think it'd be very difficult for anything which would seem to be so retrograde and such a breach of human rights, not just of asylum seekers, but a wider breach of human rights. I don't see that getting through the Lords very easily. Partly because we have quite some distinguished retired lawyers and so on the crossbenches, and I can't help thinking that they would have more political fight in them on an issue like this than they might have on issues that are more the ding-dong of party politics. So I just don't see the government getting it through. In any case, well, they might, but I don't think so. In any case, if we amend it beyond recognition, then they can't use the Parliament Act because they're up against the general election deadline. So I'm not sure quite how the government are going to do this. Whether it's just brave words, I don't know. But certainly we're into virtually uncharted territory in terms of parliamentary procedures and emergency legislation of this sort, which would, as I say, tear up our adherence to a number of international treaties and conventions. Now, look, I just want to say a little bit about my background before I get to the heart of what I want to say. And my background, as you mentioned, the main advantage of having come to Britain as an unaccompanied child refugee is that when campaigning on behalf of unaccompanied child refugees, the government are a bit embarrassed because if they attack unaccompanied child refugees too much, it seems like a personal attack on me. So although I've never used my background politically and I've never called it the Dubs Amendment, that was the media that did it, not me at all. I wouldn't be so pompous. However, I hope not anyway. But politically, it's helpful to be an unaccompanied child refugee if one is arguing with the government about that. Now, look, I want to say a bit about what our policy is about asylum claims, local welcomes, issues to do with Europe and internationally. But let me just say, can I just say a word about the Middle East? Not because it's relevant, but because I'm going to say it. And that is this: I think we should have had a ceasefire. I think we should advocate a ceasefire. I can't see any other way. I'm sorry that my beloved Labour Party has been caught on the wrong foot on this, but I think that's all I need to say. You don't want a long lecture on why I think that, but I think you'll understand. What it has done, however, among other things, the situation in the Middle East has been to give rise both to anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And I've had some of it in messages I get, but not very much. I should make it clear that although everybody in public life gets a bit of abuse, women in public life get it much worse. One has to talk to women in public life because misogyny is linked to racism in a way so that women in public life I'll say get it many times worse than I do. I've had messages some little while ago saying pity you survived the Holocaust and stuff like that, but you know it's not as serious to me as what is said to some women in public life, and particularly to black women in public life. I think it can be pretty awful. Look, I came to this country through a remarkable man who organised the kinder transport from Prague, a man called Nicky Winton, who died a few years ago, aged 106, and 10,000 kinder transport kids came from Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia in 1938-39, and some of us have been campaigning that if we could take 10,000 then, we can take 10,000 now. However, I just make one comment about that. I never thought of myself, because of my background, English is my third language, in case you're wondering, and if I make a bad speech, I can always plead that it is in my third language, and that shuts up many of my critics. However, I often make bad speeches, they don't always say so. Anyway, but I never thought of myself as being suitable material to be an MP, and I set my ambitions. I thought with my background, how could I? It was a sort of lack of self-confidence about it all, which is shared by many refugees who arrived today. At any rate, I was persuaded out of this by an MP I met, and anyway, so I managed to get there. Let us remind ourselves a bit about recent history. In 1916, we had an immigration bill, or what became the 2016 Act, and there was this thing called Section 67, and I repeat, I never called it the Dubs Amendment, but I was having a discussion with Yvette Cooper, who was chair at that time of the Home Affairs Committee, and we talked about a possible amendment, which I then put down. And the amendment was simply to say that we should take originally 3,000 child refugees, mainly those that were in northern France and on the Greek islands and so on. Fairly mild amendment. It ran up against something which I'd never heard of before, and that's something called, but you all know it, financial privilege. I'm not going to ask a show of hands, but I didn't know. Anyway, but basically what it said was that if the Lords amend something which involves expenditure, then the Commons can reject it on the grounds that the Lord has no business in making decisions about expenditure. And as it's very difficult to find an amendment that doesn't involve expenditure. Normally, the government just ignores it, or they don't. But this time, they used it as a key argument against the amendment. I'll come on to the amendment in a minute. But what happened when I put the amendment down was that it all. Even some Tory ministers came up to me and said, "Keep going with your amendment." And I said, "But you're not supposed to say that to me. I'm in opposition. You're a government minister." "No mind," they said, "keep going with your amendment." So I found that interesting, even though the view in the Tory party then was against my amendment. What happened was that I was determined that the campaign on behalf of refugees should never be just identified with one political party. And I tried to get support from across the spectrum for obvious reasons, although it was much harder getting government backbench MPs to support it than anybody else. So what happened was that I had the amendment down, and Theresa May, who was then Home Secretary, invited me in. Now, this is a bit you won't know about. She said, "Look, can you withdraw your amendment?" And I said, "Well, why should I?" She said, "Well, if these children come, others will follow." So I said, "Just a minute, you're suggesting we turn our backs on kids sleeping rough on the jungle in Calais, kids who are, sleeping on the floor in railway stations across Europe and so on. How could I possibly do that?" So she then said to me, she didn't use these words, but she said, "I'll make a deal with you." And the offer was that if I dropped my amendment, which had the 3,000 figure in it at that point, if I dropped my amendment, then she would arrange for 3,000 people to come under the voluntary person scheme from Syrians who fled Syria, and that would be instead of my scheme. And I said, "Look, I can't do that. I just cannot turn my back. It's nice that you're offering, but we could do both." Anyway, the joke was that I left, and we agreed to disagree on this, and I said I'd continue with my amendment, and this 3,000 stayed in the system. And I didn't dare talk about it for a time in case the Home Office woke up and realised it had slipped through. Or maybe, I don't know what the motive was. Anyway, it did stay, and so it was actually a better victory than any I could claim. However, a large majority in the Lords passed this amendment, and when it got to the Commons, this financial privilege thing came in, and so it came back to Lords, and we had a bigger majority, and we had to change the wording and drop the 3,000 figure. And then what happened was that public opinion suddenly woke up to what was happening, and this was politically quite remarkable. I think influenced by terrible pictures coming on our newsreels from Syrians who'd fled. Alan Kurdi, a little Syrian boy, drowned on a Mediterranean beach, and this shocked public opinion. So when I was walking down the street and somebody shouted at me, normally when they shout at politicians, it's abuse. But the words were "keep going with your amendment," and I thought that was a sign of the times. So strengthened by public opinion, Theresa May asked me to go and see her again. And again, she's still Home Secretary, and she said, "We propose to accept your amendment." She didn't say it's because the wave of public opinion meant that there were enough government supporting MPs who were going to vote for the amendment when it got to the Commons, and therefore they were going to lose it. So rather than lose it, they conceded. Anyway, whatever the motive, it happened. And then, having been promised by the then immigration minister, that the government would accept the letter and spirit of the amendment, they then cut the number to 480 out of what was originally had been 3,000. Now, when I had the original 3,000 figure, many people said to me, "This is very weak. Can't you do better than that?" Well, I said, we're trying to achieve something. And then it got cut back to 480. Anyway, it was why? I said, why? And they said, well, because we can't find any more foster families in local authority areas who would accommodate the children, the refugee children. And I, with the aid of some NGOs, including Safe Passage, we contacted local authorities, and we were offered 1,500 places. So much for the 480. So that was one argument. In the meantime, there were one or two references to the High Court, JR references to the High Court, and the NGO said, would I go to the High Court? I mean, just down the road from here. I said, well, I said, it'll help if you're there. So the thing had already started. It was on the way the government were handling some of these refugees in Calais. So I got into the High Court. I came in late. It started, and the Home Office official sitting in the front gave me what I can only describe as the least enthusiastic smile I've ever received. But anyway, we won that one. I was also slightly embarrassed because the judge said, "Oh, you're here. Nice to see you here. It's good that politicians come along and see the consequences of what they're doing." Which I thought was, I wasn't used to being picked out like that. I wasn't used to the High Court is not my venue. Anyway, so that was just a little incident. Then came a more significant issue with our leaving the EU. In the EU, we'd had something called the Dublin Treaty, part of which, for short, we called Dublin III, which basically said a refugee child or refugee-seeking child in one EU country can apply to join family in another EU country. Okay? Fairly straightforward. So a Syrian boy in Paris could apply to join an uncle in Birmingham, whatever. And we were concerned that this was a good measure because we were getting more kids there than the ones under my earlier amendment, which related to ones who didn't have family here. We were getting more over here on the family union basis. And of course, we were worried we'd lose that on leaving the EU. So I got an amendment through which would oblige the government to negotiate to continue the Dublin III provisions even after we left the EU. I'm fairly straightforward. And that got into the 2017 Act. Came the 2019 Act, and it was taken out. I was absolutely incandescent. I mean, how dare you do this? I mean, what's going on? And they said, well, and then they did something. I supposedly shut me up. They arranged a meeting in Parliament with 3 government ministers and 7 officials, and with me. I mean, the odds were 10 to 1, which I thought was quite fair, given I had the arguments. And anyway, it was a bit. I said, look, why have you done this? They said, oh, it'll be okay. They'll get in under the immigration rules. Not to, of course they didn't. They pretty well stopped it. Anyway, the immigration minister who did most of the talking looked at me and said, don't you trust me? And I lied. I said, yes, I trust you personally, but I don't trust the government. Now, I was a bit of a cop-out. I should have said, I don't trust you. But you know, some of us are weak in critical moments, and I was. Anyway, I said to him, anyway, you may not be minister for much longer. And he went, well, he was then promoted. Now he's gone. So he went, and I said, there's no guarantee. Anyway, your assurances aren't worth much if you're not the minister anymore. So as I say, very few of these children then arrived. And that was part of the very negative measures from the government. In the meantime, I had the chance to visit Calais, for example, and I don't know, any of you have been to, did any of you get to the Calais, the jungle or anything? Yeah. Well, so the first time I went, half the jungle was still there. A very depressing experience. But there's a shopping street in the middle, and there were displays of tear gas canisters and rubber bullets. And I said, what are they for? And they said the then French government was very worried about the activities of the National Front in that area near Calais. And so when they cleared the first half of the camp, they used tear gas and rubber bullets. And I said, but surely you can't defeat fascism by behaving like fascists. And this is intolerable. Which brings me to a wider issue, and that is the emergence of the far right in Europe. That it isn't just that the National Front in France were quite active in that part of Calais and regrettably in other places as well. It was also that the far right have now been making political gains. I mean, the Hungarians were always like that, but the Slovaks have just joined them, the Austrians, the Italians, the French. Angela Merkel lost her job partly because they took a million Syrians, and then her position was much weakened in France. So we've seen the far right emerging in Europe, and they're exploiting the issue of asylum seekers and refugees for their own political ends. And I'm bound to say, it is great regret, they have been getting votes and doing pretty well out of the process, which is why I reinforce my view that we have got to keep public opinion on our side. That if we don't have public opinion on our side, then we will not win these arguments. It's going to be much more difficult. In the meantime, I also visited some refugee camps in Greece, mainland Greece, and on Lesbos. I even went to a camp in Jordan. The Jordan camp was interesting. It's called Zaatari. It has 70,000 people. It's got prefab buildings. It's got electricity. It's got things like sanitation and so on. It still is a depressing place because there's no future. What can people do? They're stuck there. They're 40 miles from the Syrian border, but they said we can't go back there. The one enlightening thing that I've found on every visit to a refugee czar is the volunteers, particularly in Calais. But there have been volunteers who've young people, mainly but not exclusively from this country, who've gone to give a year or two of their lives working with the NGOs and helping with food and shelter and so on. Tremendous people who get very few accolades. They do their business and they work for a year or two, and they deserve far more praise and far more appreciation, because we're not just a country of bankers and millions of pounds for head of NatWest or whatever. Sorry, I shouldn't be getting into that one. But well, you know, we have some very decent young people who are doing a great thing, and it is right to say this is terrific. The other people I talk to a lot are the faith groups who've look. I'm a humanist, nevertheless, the faith groups seem to tolerate me, and I've been to talk to more faith groups. There was one occasion when I was asked to go to synagogue, and I said to them, you know, tomorrow night I'm talking to end of Ramadan event in Trafalgar Square, and I said to them it'll be the same speech, and they looked at me with amazement. However, I topped and tailed it differently, and of course schools. I think school students are the best of all because they get it. They absolutely get it like that. And I've sometimes talked, and it's hard for me to persuade them not to leave school and go and be volunteers in Calais, but that's a good motive. And of course, some brilliant NGOs who work and pull all these things together. And I repeat that I've tried to make sure that all these campaigns are not the property of one political party. Now, in the most recent legislation, the illegal migration bill, the government did a number of things which turned the clock back even more than I thought possible. For example, you will be aware of this, and this is where we got these 20 amendments against the government. They've made it illegal to cross the channel by an unapproved route. And there are no safe and legal routes left, possibly from Ukraine. And if anybody can get out of Afghanistan, otherwise there are no safe and legal routes. And yet they say, if you don't come on the safe or legal route, we will deny you the chance of claiming asylum. You'll not be able to. Well, that is totally in breach of our obligations under the 51 Convention. We've said this to the government, and they say, well, it doesn't matter. We know better than the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. I wouldn't have thought they do. I'd have thought the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees is much more likely to be the best guardian of the convention than our government. And then we've had the language. Now, obviously, I'm out of date because I don't know what language the new Home Secretary will use. But the previous Home Secretary used language like invaders and hate crime and so on. And I'm afraid if we are going to accommodate and look after asylum seekers in our local communities, then language of hostility, of abuse, is going to undermine the willingness of local communities to provide the support which they have to do if it's going to work properly. And I just thought that some of the language that she used, which was not totally disowned. I mean, some of the government ministers said, well, I wouldn't use quite that language, but I agree with the sentiment. I think such hostility was absolutely appalling. Now, during the Brexit referendum, I think I probably knocked on as many doors as anybody you've met campaigning for Remain. However, and clearly take back control meant keep them out. That's what it meant to people, and people understood that. Anyway, I was in northwest London, so there was mainly a Remain area. But one person said, "I'm going to vote Leave," and I said, "Why?" And she said, "Well, it's all these people coming in, these refugees and others." And I said, "Well, just a minute." I had a small procedure in hospital for half a day, and everybody who treated me, doctors, physios and so on, doctors and nurses and so on, they were all immigrants or refugees. Where would I have been without them? And she said significantly, it's not those that are already here, it's the further ones that are going to come. Enter Boris Johnson with his lying claim that if we didn't leave the EU, 70 to 80 million Turks were poised to enter, which is a complete lie. Anyway, he knew that Britain could veto this, even if it got that far, which it showed no signs of doing. So I think that was all part of the background. And of course, some of our efforts to get public opinion on side were negated by that sort of campaign by Boris Johnson and other things that Nigel Farage said, and which has been said more recently by Suella Braverman. So I think the Illegal Migration Act has is a pretty miserable bit of legislation. By making it illegal, it also, and it's what the government say, you've got to go to you can only claim asylum in the first safe country. They keep saying that. Now, UNHCR have made it very clear that is not what the convention says. You don't have to claim asylum in the first safe country in the way they say. In any case, if we did have the practice of saying that asylum seekers must claim asylum in the first safe country they reach, then the million Syrians who got to Germany would have been stuck in Greece and Italy. So I think what our government is saying is wrong in principle, and in practice, it is absolutely unworkable. But what they have done, and Rwanda was part of this package that I mentioned. What they've done is that they've set out to criminalize. They've criminalized asylum seekers, all because they want to stop the boats coming over. Now, everybody wants to stop the boats coming over in one sense, because people trafficking is a vile activity and very dangerous. On the other hand, the numbers of people who've been crossing by boat, or they say the numbers are down a bit this year. I think the weather had something to do with it. However, the numbers were probably not much different from what happened before they came by boat when they came in the back of lorries. But when they came on the back of a lorry, they were dumped on a motorway intersection, and there wasn't the photographic evidence that you get when you see a boat coming in laden with people. So, and in any case, the majority of people who came either by boat or in the back of lorries have been given asylum status. But, you know, they are not the people that the government has said they are. These are people who were given legitimate asylum status or refugee status by, as under the 1951 convention. In any case, the latest figures show that we are 17th out of 18 European countries in relation to size in taking asylum seekers. Now, I've never said that we can take them all. And indeed, the majority of asylum seekers who get to France claim asylum in France, contrary to what some conservative politician was saying to me on the telly yesterday morning. But the only sensible way forward, to my mind, is that we must share responsibility. So when Angela Merkel appealed for help when 1 million Syrians came, Europe just said no. And even more recently, when there's a fire on Lesbos in the refugee camp, you know, very few countries were willing to help. And I don't think we can move forward unless we're willing to share responsibility. Now, it's made more difficult by the right-wing parties on the continent. But I believe as a matter of future policy, we have got to find a way of sharing responsibility. And we certainly need, I believe, a Europe-wide policy of international cooperation. It's interesting that according to some figures I saw, the Belgians have stopped the traffickers more than the French have. Now, the British government, first of all, Liz Truss abused President Macron when she was Prime Minister for a few weeks. And we've had our ministers go over there. Now, I'm actually not sure the French could possibly be doing a bit more, but I think there has to be an agreement with them, not just a limited arrangement that we have so far. In any case, I was in Paris with the Human Rights Committee, and we went to the British Embassy in Paris, and they had a Home Office official working there, and that Home Office official was looking at the whole issue of the boats. And he said, look, beware. As far as the French are concerned, they don't care very much about the boats across the Channel. They're much more worried about boats coming across the Mediterranean. The numbers are much larger, and they're much more concerned. So, you know, the Brits shouldn't be moaning so much. But anyway, that was part of it. But however, of course, we should have a better agreement. And I frankly, if it was left to me, to us, I would say to the French, look, there are people there in Calais sleeping now under the trees because the jungle's now gone. I mean, mostly sleeping under the trees, and they have family connections with this country. They have reasons for being here, and I would think we should go to the French and say, look, are there any people there we can identify as having connection with Britain, either through family or because of an education here or language or something like that? And we'll take those. Just take those right away, and then we'll say to the French, and the condition is that you're then tougher with the rest. It will be a possible arrangement, but I think we've got to do something. Now came the Ukraine, and there was quite a good response from the British public up to a point. Although people say, why was there a better response? I'm going to be quite blunt about this. There were two reasons, I believe. One was because we saw on our newsreels what was happening in Ukraine, better than we were able to see what was happening inside Syria or Afghanistan or in Ethiopia or the other source countries. But the other reason was the Ukrainians are white, and bluntly, and I think that's also made the public, sadly, but I think that's it. Anyway, there was a brief period, I'm going to give you one example, a brief period when unaccompanied children from Ukraine could apply for visas. And this girl, I'm going to call her Valia for short, she got a visa. Well, she was eligible for a visa, and she couldn't come. Her father's fighting, her mum's even more into a war zone, looking after other members of the family. And this Valia is 16, 17 years old, well, she was then, and she was so frightened on her own in a war zone, she kept her room locked, didn't go out. I put this to both raised it in Parliament and raised it in one-to-one meetings with ministers, junior ministers, and the answer was the then Home Secretary Priti Patel was saying there aren't enough safeguards. I said, this is ridiculous. The host family have both been vetted. They're both safe, fully up to standard for safeguarding. The school has been vetted and the local authority is happy. That is gold-plated vetting. And the Home Secretary thinks that a girl on her own, terrified out of her mind in a war zone, is safer than with a family that is supportive and that is going to look after her. Anyway, I had several discussions with the minister, and the government minister clearly was unhappy about this and said it was Priti Patel who was blocking it. I mean, I thought with Priti Patel was bad enough till we had Suella, but anyway, it's about Priti Patel. And eventually the minister said, I said, what can I do? I mean, this is awful, because there are other kids in the same position. This is awful. And he said, shout at me. So I did, and it worked. And the nice outcome is that I had lunch in the Lords with her host mum and the girl, and she's now she's just done her A-levels. And she hardly spoke English when she came. That's pretty good. So there was a happy outcome there. But I don't know in how many cases there wasn't a happy outcome. Can I say also, in terms of the rhetoric, I think we have to distinguish between refugees and asylum seekers on one hand and migrants on the other. Now, there is nothing unworthy about being an economic migrant, perfectly respectable thing, but it doesn't give you the human rights protection that you're entitled to under the Geneva Convention if you're an asylum seeker. You should have more protection. And of course, on top of that, there are many countries where there are internally displaced people. They outnumber the people who fled into another country for safety, and they don't have any international protection at all. Because if you try and protect people who fled for safety in another part of their own country, they were interfering in the internal affairs of that country. So it's a difficult one. However, the distinction between refugees and asylum seekers on one hand and migrants on the other has been totally blurred by our media, to the point when, we're dealing with very large, well, relatively large numbers for a Tory party that said that they would keep the numbers down. 600,000, I think, came last year, and of those, about 45,000 were asylum seekers. So the rhetoric is about asylum seekers, but there are other people who've come here by Hong Kong and so on and so forth. So I think it's important in terms of a sensible debate that we don't allow the merging of immigrants with asylum seekers who I think are entitled to greater protection. And I always believe that if one explains to people what it is that asylum seekers have gone through, what it is they're fleeing, the terrible circumstances, then the British public become more sympathetic. I know one Syrian boy said to me he'd seen his father blown up in front of him by a bomb in either Aleppo or Damascus. What a frightful, terrifying experience for anybody that you carry that with the rest of your life. And yet, unless people understand it, that is the case for having a refugee convention. Now, how do we deal with people who've arrived here? I'm going to give you a little anecdote. I hope I don't upset any football fans who aren't Fulham or Chelsea supporters. But the Fulham and Chelsea, this is before the pandemic, the Fulham and Chelsea foundations arranged an evening of football training for young refugee boys. Now, if I'd had my thoughts properly tuned, I'd have said refugee girls as well, but you can't fight every battle all the time. So I failed on that one. So we had an evening of training for refugee boys on Fulham football ground. And Guy Lineker came along, great guy. And it was a super evening. When I was there, I'd have given anything to be able to have training on a Premier Football Club ground. But however, it was all done to make the thing realize these kids are normal like everybody else. And of course, more importantly, they had a match in a park in Fulham, and there were just kids playing, and a mixture of refugees and non-refugees. And it's a matter, I can't find a better way. We've got to normalize it. Now, I had a student of a doctor who was a student of psychiatry, lent to me by the Royal College of Psychiatry, and I sent her around. I got it for 1 day a week, for about 30 weeks, talking to local authorities about mental health support. I did this because I talked to some local authority leaders who said that after money shortages, mental health was an important issue. And I could talk the whole time about mental health, but it is an important issue, and there's a real patchwork of support. Some areas are quite good and some areas are not so good. But all I would say is, in addition, that because people have had bad experiences, it doesn't mean they need mental health support. There was one Syrian boy who said, please don't treat me as a mental health case. I want to play football and eat food and enjoy myself like everybody else. I don't want to be a mental health case. So we mustn't be patronizing and saying, because you're a refugee, you must have mental health problems. But some do. And 2 of them killed themselves in South London because of the experiences they've been through. So it is a real issue. The people who come here, in my experience, if they're of educational age, they want to continue with their education. That's what they want to do. And those adults want to work. And denying them the right to work is, I think, absolutely appalling. It's very limited. They've been here for a year, and only if they apply for a shortage occupation. Bearing in mind how long people are waiting for a decision about asylum. The latest figure was 170,000 were waiting for an asylum claim. That is the incentive for people to come here, because they say they're not going to determine my claim anyway. I'll be here for a long time, and the government just can't get this one sorted out at all. And then we have army camps and barges all being used, and then the Rwanda scheme, which I hope is dead forever. So when people arrive here, I'm going to bring my remarks to a close in a minute. I'm conscious of the time. It's important that they get a good welcome from local communities, and they're encouraged to take part in local activities. That's what they want to do, and they want to work. Above all, they want to work. We must expect in the future there will be more population movements brought about by wars, oppression, and climate change, and I think we've got to live with that. And let's remember that apart from Europe, where we're a bit more aware, there are 1 million Rohingyas who fled Myanmar and are now in Bangladesh. They're too far out of reach of the television cameras. So it's a wider issue than just the one I've been talking about. So looking into the future, climate change will cause further movements. The far right can become even more pernicious in Europe, hopefully not. We must avoid the stop the boats becoming an election issue, because I think that would just not help asylum seekers and refugees. I wouldn't like it to be an election debate. It may have to be, but I hope not. And lastly, a little story. In Battersea, this Jordan refugee camp, a young man came to me, Syrian, and he said, I said, well, what's your situation? He said, well, I finished my education in the camp. It's good. He said, I've tried to get a job in the camp. I can't. I've tried to get a job outside the camp, and I can't. What hope is there for me? And I finish on this. It seems to me that human beings can put up with terrible conditions, physical, if there is hope at the end of the line, if there is something they can hope for. And I believe our policy towards asylum seekers and refugees should be giving people hope. People who have lost everything in their lives, people who are absolutely the victims, for which they're not responsible. And I think offering them a bit of hope by having a decent, humane policy on asylum seekers and refugees is the least that we can do.